Captain Mara Lynch stood at attention in the briefing room at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, her jaw tight as she listened to the snickers behind her. At 5'4" and 130 pounds, she knew exactly what they were thinking. She'd heard it all before. "Can't believe they're sending her with us," one of the men muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. "Diversity hire," another whispered back. Mara didn't turn around. She'd learned years ago that reactions only fed the fire. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on Colonel Davidson as he outlined their mission. A humanitarian evacuation in a hostile zone, 12 hours. In and out, the colonel's voice was grave. "Intelligence reports indicate the area is crawling with insurgents. This won't be a walk in the park. You'll be extracting 23 civilians from a medical compound in the mountains. The terrain is rough, and if things go sideways, there's no backup coming for at least 6 hours." Mara felt her pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of mission she'd trained for her entire career. But as she glanced around the room at the faces of Alpha Team, she saw nothing but doubt staring back at her. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison, the team leader, crossed his arms as he looked her up and down. "Sir, with all due respect, this operation requires peak physical capability. Are we sure the captain is the right fit?" The room fell silent. Everyone knew what he was really asking. Colonel Davidson's expression hardened. "Captain Lynch has passed every qualification test this unit requires. She earned her place on this team, Sergeant. Or are you questioning my judgment?" "No, sir," Morrison replied quickly, but his eyes told a different story. After the briefing, Mara headed to the armory to check her gear. She heard footsteps behind her and didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Look, nothing personal," Morrison said, his tone attempting diplomacy but failing. "It's just, combat is different. It's not about test scores or classroom scenarios. When bullets start flying and you're hauling equipment through mountains, size matters. Strength matters." Mara turned to face him, her green eyes steady and unflinching. "I know exactly what combat is, Sergeant. I've done 3 tours. How many have you done?" Morrison's face reddened. 2, but that's not what? Not the point." Mara stepped closer. "You're right about one thing. When bullets fly, what matters is whether you can trust the person next to you. So let me be clear. I will do my job. The question is, will you do yours? Or are you going to spend the whole mission second-guessing your commanding officer's decisions?" She didn't wait for an answer. She turned back to her equipment, checking her rifle with practiced efficiency. Morrison left without another word, but Mara knew the conversation was far from over. She'd faced this same doubt at every stage of her career. In basic training, they said she'd wash out in the first week. At Ranger School, they bet money on when she'd quit. When she applied for the Special Operations Task Force, 3 superior officers tried to talk her out of it, but Mara Lynch didn't quit. Ever. She thought back to her childhood in rural Montana, where her father had raised her and her 2 brothers alone after their mother died. Daniel Lynch had been a Marine, tough as iron and twice as stubborn. He never once told Mara she couldn't do something because she was a girl. When her brothers learned to shoot, she learned to shoot. When they learned to hunt and survive in the wilderness, so did she. And when they tried to tell her she couldn't keep up, her father would shake his head and say, "Don't tell her what she can't do. Show her what she needs to learn, then get out of her way." That philosophy had shaped everything about who Mara became. She didn't ask for special treatment. She didn't want anyone to go easy on her. She simply wanted the chance to prove herself on equal footing. But equal footing, she'd learned, was something she had to fight for every single day. The next morning, Alpha Team assembled on the tarmac at 0400 hours. The pre-dawn air was cool and damp. Mara arrived first, her gear already loaded, her uniform crisp. One by one, the others arrived. Morrison, Chen, Rodriguez, Patterson, Williams, 6 soldiers total, including her. They boarded the helicopter in silence. As they lifted off into the darkness, Mara caught Morrison watching her again. This time, she met his gaze directly, refusing to look away first. Finally, he turned his attention to the window. The flight took 3 hours. Below them, the landscape shifted from the flat terrain of North Carolina to computer simulations of the mountainous region they'd be entering. The compound they were extracting from sat in a valley, surrounded by steep ridges that would make approach and evacuation treacherous. "Listen up," Morrison shouted over the helicopter noise as they approached the drop zone. "Chen and Rodriguez, you secure the perimeter. Patterson and Williams, you help load the civilians. Captain Lynch, you stay with the vehicles and coordinate communications. Mara's eyes narrowed. Communications duty was support work, something they'd assigned to the least combat-ready member of a team. Sergeant, I'm trained for tactical extraction, she said firmly. Put me in the compound. Morrison shook his head. I need someone I can trust on comms. That's you. It was a slap in the face, and everyone on that helicopter knew it. Chen looked uncomfortable. Rodriguez stared at his boots. But no one said anything. Mara considered challenging the order directly, but she knew it would only make things worse. So she nodded once, her expression unreadable. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust. They had 12 hours. None of them knew that in less than 6, everything would go catastrophically wrong. And when it did, Mara Lynch would be the only thing standing between her team and certain death. The compound was worse than the intelligence reports had suggested. The building was half destroyed, its walls pockmarked with bullet holes, entire sections collapsed from previous attacks. The medical staff inside had been treating civilians caught in crossfire for weeks, operating with almost no supplies and no way out. Mara established her communications post near the vehicles, a position that gave her sight lines to 3 of the 4 approach routes. It was solid tactical placement, but it wasn't where she belonged. And everyone knew it. Through her headset, she listened to Morrison's team move through the compound, coordinating with the medical staff and preparing the civilians for evacuation. There were 23 people total, 15 children, 6 women, 2 elderly men, all of them terrified, all of them depending on Alpha Team to get them out alive. Comms, this is Alpha Leader. Morrison's voice crackled through her earpiece. We've got a problem. 3 of the civilians are on stretchers. Can't walk. We're going to need more time to rig transport. Copy that, Alpha Leader, Mara responded, her voice calm and professional. You've got 8 hours before extraction window closes. Weather's holding. You're clear. But even as she said it, Mara felt something prickling at the back of her neck. Years of combat experience had given her instincts that screamed when something was wrong. And right now those instincts were screaming. She scanned the ridgeline to the east, then the west. Nothing visible. But that didn't mean nothing was there. Alpha Leader, recommend we expedite, Mara said into her mic. Something doesn't feel right. There was a pause. Then Morrison's voice came back and she could hear the dismissiveness in it. Comms, the area is secure. Focus on your job and let us do ours. Mara's jaw clenched, but she didn't respond. Instead, she pulled out her binoculars and began a systematic scan of every possible position an enemy could use for surveillance or attack. Inside the compound, Morrison and his team worked to prepare the civilians. The medical staff had done their best under impossible circumstances, but many of the people they'd been treating were in rough shape. Malnutrition, infected wounds, trauma. How long have you been here? Patterson asked one of the doctors, a woman in her 50s with exhausted eyes. 43 days, the doctor replied. They hit the main hospital in town. We set up here thinking the mountains would keep us safe. We were wrong. Chen helped lift a child onto a stretcher, careful not to disturb the IV line running into the boy's thin arm. Why didn't you leave sooner? And go where? The doctor asked. The roads are controlled by militia. They shoot first, ask questions never. When your government said someone was finally coming, I didn't believe it, thought it was too late. Rodriguez moved to the window, his weapon ready. It's not too late. We're getting you out. But even as he said it, he felt the same unease that Mara had sensed. The compound was too quiet. The valley was too still. In his experience, that kind of quiet came right before all hell broke loose. Outside, Mara had moved from her designated position. She couldn't shake the feeling, and she'd learned long ago to trust her gut. She advanced 50 meters east using the terrain for cover, moving the way her father had taught her to move through the Montana wilderness. Silent. Careful. Aware. That's when she saw it. A glint of light from the ridgeline. Just for a second, but it was enough. Someone was up there. Her heart rate spiked, but her hands stayed steady. She raised her binoculars and focused on the spot. It took 30 seconds of patient observation, but then she saw it again. Movement. And not just one person. Multiple positions. They were being watched. Alpha Leader, this is comms, she said urgently into her mic. We have eyes on us. Ridgeline east, multiple positions. Recommend immediate evacuation. Comms, are you sure? Morrison's voice was skeptical. We haven't seen anything on thermals. I'm sure, Mara said firmly. I've got visual confirmation. We need to move now. There was a pause that felt like an eternity. Then Morrison's voice came back. Negative, comms. We need another hour minimum to get the critical patients ready for transport. Return to your position and maintain protocol. Mara felt anger flash through her, hot and immediate. He wasn't listening. He was so convinced she didn't belong there that he wouldn't trust her judgment, even when lives were on the line. She keyed her mic again. Sergeant, I strongly advise you, return to position, Captain. That's an order. Mara stood there for a moment, every instinct screaming at her to ignore the order and do what needed to be done. But military discipline was absolute. She'd spent her entire career following orders. Even when she disagreed with them, she returned to her communications post. But she kept her weapon ready and her eyes on that ridgeline. 15 minutes later, the first shot rang out. It hit the vehicle to Mara's left, punching through metal with a sound like thunder. Then came the second shot. The third. Within seconds, the entire valley erupted in gunfire. Contact! Contact! Rodriguez's voice shouted through the radio. We're taking fire from multiple positions. Mara was already moving. She laid down, suppressing fire toward the ridgeline, her rifle barking in controlled bursts. Her mind shifted into combat mode. Everything slowing down, crystallizing into perfect clarity. Alpha Team report. Morrison's voice had lost its condescension. Now it just sounded scared. We're pinned down, Chen shouted back. They're on the North Ridge and the East Ridge. We can't get the civilians to the vehicles. Mara assessed the situation in seconds. The team was trapped inside the compound. The vehicles were taking fire. The enemy had superior position and had clearly been planning this ambush for a while. They needed someone to break the enemy's advantage. They needed someone to do something impossible. Alpha Leader, I'm moving to flank the east position, Mara said into her mic. Negative. Comms, stay with the vehicles. But Mara was already gone. She'd spent 3 years in these mountains on her second tour. She knew terrain like this. She knew how to use it. She moved like a shadow, using every rock, every depression, every bit of cover. The enemy was focused on the compound, which meant their backs were partially exposed to someone willing to scale the ridge from the south approach. It was a climb that would test every ounce of her strength and endurance. The ridge was nearly vertical in places. One mistake would mean a fatal fall, but Mara Lynch didn't make mistakes. She climbed. Behind her, she could hear the battle intensifying. Morrison and the team were returning fire, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The civilians were screaming. Children were crying. Mara's hands found holds in the rock. Her boots dug into narrow ledges. Her shoulders burned. Her legs shook. But she didn't stop. 20 feet, 40 feet, 60 feet, and then she was at the top. Mara crested the ridge and immediately dropped to a prone position. Below her, spread across the eastern ridge, were 8 insurgents with heavy weapons. They had the perfect vantage point, raining fire down on the compound. They thought they were untouchable. They were wrong. Mara controlled her breathing, settling into the familiar rhythm of combat. Her father's voice echoed in her memory from a hunting trip when she was 12. Patience before precision. Precision before speed. You only get one chance at the first shot. Make it count. She acquired her first target. Squeezed the trigger. The insurgent dropped. The others immediately began to scatter, trying to locate where the shot came from. But Mara was already moving, repositioning, using the terrain the same way they had been. Second target. Squeeze. Drop. Now they knew someone was up there with them. 3 of them turned their weapons toward her position. But she'd already moved again. The ridge had dozens of rock formations, natural cover everywhere. She used every bit of it. Third target, squeeze, drop. Comms, what the hell are you doing? Morrison's voice came through her earpiece, confused and urgent. My job, Mara replied simply, then switched off her radio. She needed total focus. The remaining 5 insurgents were now fully aware of the threat on their flank. 2 of them began advancing on her position, while the other 3 maintained fire on the compound. They were trained fighters, moving with tactical discipline, but Mara had something they didn't expect. She wasn't trying to hold position. She was hunting. She circled north using a gap in the rocks and came up behind the 2 who were advancing on her previous location. They never saw her coming. 4th target, squeeze, drop. The 5th man spun around, his weapon swinging toward her, and for a fraction of a second Mara thought she'd miscalculated. But her muscle memory was faster than conscious thought. She fired from the hip, a technique she'd practiced 10,000 times on the range. Fifth target. Drop. 3 left, and now they were rattled. Below in the compound, Morrison was witnessing something he'd never expected. The enemy fire from the east ridge had been cut by more than half. Someone up there was taking them apart. Did anyone else deploy to the ridge? He shouted to his team. Negative, Patterson called back. We're all here. Then who? Morrison stopped mid-sentence as the realization hit him. Lynch. Chen, crouched behind a concrete barrier with 2 frightened children, shook his head in disbelief. She climbed that? In the middle of a firefight? On the ridge, Mara was engaged in close quarters combat now. The remaining 3 insurgents had abandoned their heavy weapons and were moving through the rocks with assault rifles. The engagement range had collapsed to less than 20 meters. This was the kind of fighting where size and strength were supposed to matter, where a 130-pound woman was supposed to be at a fatal disadvantage. Mara moved through the terrain like water, never where they expected, always one step ahead. She used their assumptions against them. They expected her to retreat, to seek cover and defend. Instead, she advanced, 6th target, close range, squeeze, drop. A burst of gunfire tore past her head so close she felt the heat. She rolled left, came up in a new position and acquired the shooter. 7th target, squeeze, drop. 1 left. The final insurgent was smart. He'd gone silent, hidden somewhere in the rocks, waiting for her to make a mistake. It became a deadly game of patience. Mara slowed her breathing, listening. The wind, the distant sound of gunfire from the compound. And there, the faintest scrape of a boot against stone. She moved toward it, silent as death. They saw each other at the same moment, both weapons coming up. For a frozen instant, they stared at each other across 10 feet of empty air. Then Mara did something unexpected. She spoke. Drop it, she said in Arabic, one of the 4 languages she'd learned during her tours. You can live. The insurgent's eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't expected that. Hadn't expected a woman soldier. Hadn't expected perfect Arabic. In that moment of hesitation, his aim wavered. Mara's didn't. 8th target. Squeeze. Drop. The ridge went silent. Mara stood there for a moment, her heart pounding, her hands steady on her weapon. Then she keyed her radio back on. Alpha Leader, East Ridge is clear. You have a window. Get those civilians out now. Morrison's voice came back immediately, and for the first time there was respect in it. Copy that comms, Jesus Christ. How did you, no time, Mara cut him off. The North Ridge still has shooters. I'm moving to flank them. Evacuate while I keep them busy. Negative, we need you back here too. But Mara had already switched off the radio again. The North Ridge was a quarter-mile away, and Morrison's team needed at least 10 minutes to get the civilians to the vehicles. She had to buy them that time. She began moving along the ridge line, a route that would take her toward the north position. It was even more treacherous than the climb up. Narrow paths with deadly drops on both sides. One section required her to traverse a ledge barely 6 inches wide with a 100-foot fall below. She made it across without looking down. The North Ridge position came into view. 4 insurgents focused entirely on the compound below. They had no idea their East Ridge team had been eliminated. No idea someone was coming up behind them. Mara settled into position and opened fire. She took down 2 in the first 3 seconds. The other 2 immediately sought cover, returning fire. But they were now fighting on 2 fronts, Mara from above and behind, Morrison's team from the compound. It was a tactical nightmare for them. Within 90 seconds, the North Ridge was silent too. All positions clear, Mara said into her radio, breathing hard now. Execute evacuation. Down in the compound, Morrison didn't hesitate this time. Move. Move, move. Everyone to the vehicles now. His team sprang into action with renewed urgency. They loaded the stretcher patients first, then the children, then the remaining civilians. The medical staff helped, working with desperate efficiency. Chen and Rodriguez provided covering fire, but there was nothing left to shoot at. Mara had eliminated every enemy position. Within 8 minutes, all 23 civilians and the medical staff were loaded into the vehicles. Morrison did a final head count, then keyed his radio. Comms were loaded. Return to extraction point. Negative, Mara's voice came back. I need to backtrack down the ridge. It'll take me 15 minutes. Start moving. I'll catch up. We're not leaving without you, Morrison said, and this time there was no question in his voice. It was a statement of fact. That's an order, Sergeant, Mara replied. Those civilians need medical attention. Every minute counts. Go, I'll be right behind you. Morrison looked at his team, at the frightened children, at the wounded on stretchers. He made the decision. Understood. We'll maintain slow speed until you catch up. Don't take too long, Captain. Wouldn't dream of it, Mara said. The vehicles began moving out of the valley as Mara started her descent from the ridge. It was even harder going down than coming up. Her arms were shaking now, muscles pushed beyond their normal limits. Her hands were scraped raw from the rocks, but she didn't stop. Mara was halfway down the ridge when her handhold crumbled. For a terrifying moment she was falling, her fingers scraping uselessly against stone. 70 feet of empty air below her. Then her left hand caught an outcropping, jerking her to a violent stop. Her shoulder screamed in pain and she knew immediately something had torn. She hung there suspended by one arm trying to find a foothold. Her vision swam with pain. For the first time all day, doubt crept in. Maybe she'd pushed too far. Maybe she'd finally found her limit. Then she heard her father's voice in her head. Not a memory this time, but something deeper. The core truth he'd spent her entire childhood teaching her. You don't quit because it hurts. You quit when you're done. Are you done? Mara's jaw set. Her right hand, useless a moment ago, reached up and found another hold. Then her foot found a ledge. Then her other hand. Inch by inch, with a dislocated shoulder and exhausted muscles, she continued down. It took her 25 minutes instead of 15. When she finally reached level ground, she allowed herself 10 seconds to lean against a boulder and breathe. Then she started running. The vehicles had maintained slow speed as promised. She caught up to them 3 miles from the compound, emerging from the terrain like a ghost. The last vehicle stopped and Morrison himself jumped out. You're hurt, he said, seeing how she was holding her left arm. I'm fine, Mara replied. Your shoulder is dislocated. I said I'm fine, Sergeant. Morrison looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised both of them. He came to attention and saluted. Captain Lynch, he said formally. Thank you. Mara returned the salute with her good arm, then climbed into the vehicle. They made it to the extraction point with 40 minutes to spare. The helicopter was already waiting. As they loaded the civilians, Mara finally allowed herself to feel the pain. Her shoulder was on fire. Her hands were bleeding. Every muscle in her body was screaming. Chen approached her with a medical kit. Ma'am, let me look at that shoulder. After the civilians are loaded, Mara said. Captain, you need after the civilians specialist. That's final. Chen nodded and backed off. He'd learned something today. They all had. The last civilian, a little girl no more than 6 years old, was being carried to the helicopter by Rodriguez. As she passed Mara, she reached out her small hand. Mara took it gently. Thank you, the girl said in broken English. Mara smiled, and for the first time all day, her expression softened. You're safe now. That's what matters. Once everyone was loaded, Chen finally got his chance to examine Mara's shoulder. This needs to be reset immediately. It's gonna hurt. I know, Mara said. Do it. Morrison held her good arm to brace her. Chen counted to 3, then popped the shoulder back into place. Mara's vision went white with pain, but she didn't make a sound. Just breathed through it until the worst passed. You're something else, Captain, Morrison said quietly. Mara looked at him. I'm a soldier, Sergeant. Same as you. That's all I've ever wanted to be treated as. Yeah, Morrison said, and there was something like shame in his voice. I'm starting to understand that. The flight back to base took 3 hours. Mara spent most of it in silence, watching the civilians they'd saved. The medical staff was already working on the critical cases, using the helicopter's emergency supplies. Everyone was going to make it. When they landed at Fort Bragg, Colonel Davidson was waiting on the tarmac. He took in Mara's condition, the makeshift sling, the bandaged hands, the exhaustion in her eyes, and his expression was grim. Medical now, he ordered. Sir, the civilians are being attended to by a full medical team already assembled. You've done your job, Captain. Now let us do ours. That's an order. Mara nodded and allowed herself to be led to the medical facility. 3 days later, after the debriefing and the medical examinations and the endless paperwork, Colonel Davidson called her to his office. Sit, he said. Mara sat, her arm still in a sling but already healing. She healed fast. Always had. Davidson pulled out a folder and opened it. Staff Sergeant Morrison submitted his after-action report. Would you like to know what it says? Not particularly, sir. Davidson smiled slightly. He recommended you for the Silver Star. So did every other member of Alpha Team. The civilians you saved? 17 of them have written letters to this command specifically praising your actions. He paused. The doctors say 3 of those civilians wouldn't have survived another day without medical attention. You saved 23 lives, Captain. And you saved your entire team in the process. Mara didn't respond. She didn't need recognition. She'd done what any soldier should have done. I'm also told, Davidson continued, that Sergeant Morrison has requested you as his permanent second-in-command for all future operations. He said, and I quote, I was wrong about Captain Lynch. She's the best soldier I've ever served with, and I'd trust her with my life. Now Mara did react, her eyebrows rising slightly. That's unexpected, sir, is it? Davidson asked. You eliminated 12 enemy combatants in terrain that should have been impossible to navigate during active combat. You made decisions that saved everyone under your command. You did everything a special operations soldier is supposed to do, and you did it better than most men twice your size. He leaned forward. The question I have is, why did you have to prove it again? Mara met his eyes. Because I'm a woman, sir. I'll have to prove it every time until people stop being surprised. Davidson was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. You're probably right. And that's on us, on me, on every officer who should have created an environment where proof wasn't necessary. He closed the folder. For what it's worth, Captain, you have my respect. You've always had it. But after this, you have something more valuable. What's that, sir? You have the respect of every soldier on this base. Word spreads fast in the military. By now, everyone knows what you did. And the next time someone questions whether a woman belongs in combat, there are going to be a lot of voices shutting that conversation down real quick. Mara allowed herself a small smile. That would be nice, sir. Take 2 weeks medical leave. That's not optional. When you come back, we're going to have a conversation about your future in this command. I think it's time we started preparing you for a command of your own. Mara stood, coming to attention despite the sling. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me, Captain. You earned it. Every bit of it. Mara left the office and walked out into the North Carolina sunshine. Across the base, she saw Morrison and Chen talking near the training grounds. When they spotted her, they both came to attention and saluted. She returned the salute and Morrison approached. Captain, he said, I owe you an apology. You already apologized, Sergeant. No, I thanked you. That's different. He took a breath. I judged you before you ever had a chance. I let my assumptions and my prejudices blind me to who you actually were. And because of that, I made tactical decisions that put lives at risk. That's on me, and I'm sorry. Mara studied him for a moment. She could hold the grudge. Part of her wanted to, but she'd learned a long time ago that holding grudges only hurt the person carrying them. Apology accepted, she said. Let's move forward, Morrison nodded. I meant what I said in my report. If you're willing, I'd like you as my second. Not because of what happened in the valley, because of who you are as a soldier. I'll think about it, Mara said. As she walked away, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not satisfaction exactly, not vindication, but something quieter and more lasting. Peace. She'd spent her entire career fighting to prove she belonged. Fighting against doubt, against prejudice, against assumptions about what women could and couldn't do, and she'd won those fights over and over. But this felt different. This felt like maybe finally the battle was starting to shift. Her phone buzzed, a text from her brother in Montana. He'd somehow heard about the mission, probably through military channels, and his message was short and simple. Dad would be proud. I'm proud. You showed them. Mara smiled and typed back. I showed myself too. That's what matters. That evening, as the sun set over Fort Bragg, Mara sat in her quarters and thought about the little girl on the helicopter. The one who'd reached out her hand and said thank you. That child would grow up, would live a life she'd almost lost. The doctors and aid workers would continue their mission. 23 people would see tomorrow because of what Alpha Team had done, because of what she had done, not despite being a woman. Not as some exception to a rule, but because she was a soldier who did her job when it needed to be done. They'd called her too weak for combat. They'd questioned her strength, her capability, her right to be there, until the moment came when strength wasn't about muscle mass or physical size. It was about heart, about courage, about refusing to quit when everything hurt and the odds were impossible. And in that moment, Mara Lynch had been exactly strong enough. She'd carried them all out, just like she'd always known she could, and she'd do it again as many times as it took, until the day finally came when no one was surprised anymore, until the day when women in combat weren't exceptions or diversity hires or symbols. Just soldiers, just heroes, just people doing their jobs, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. That day was coming. Mara was sure of it, and she'd keep fighting until it arrived.